It's time once again for another edition of Talk to Me. And now, here's Emmy himself, 8-time Emmy Award-winning journalist, Maynard Eaton.
Hello again, my friends. It's another week of Talk to Me, a weekly conversation with political influencers, cultural influencers, civil rights, human rights folks. Today, though, we have a nationally renowned sports journalist. His name is Terence Moore. For more than 40 years, he's been a nationally renowned sports columnist in Atlanta, San Francisco, Cincinnati, now being featured in Forbes.com, MSNBC, and man, how many jobs do you have?
You know what, man? Anybody that pays me, I'm likely to work for them, provided that they're ethically sound when it comes to journalism.
Being a Christian, listen, you covered more than 20 Super Bowls, a number of World Series, Olympic Games, Final Fours, Indianapolis 500, NBA playoffs are now and ongoing. Is this your favorite time of year? You got basketball, baseball, football on the horizon.
Well, first of all, actually, I've covered more than 30 Super Bowls, and wow. There's not a black person who's ever covered more Super Bowls than me. As a matter of fact, that's kind of a thing with me. I'm kind of like a Jackie Robinson of sports writers in so many ways. But with answer your question, you know, I was perfectly built for what I do. Primarily, and this is a thing the other day, 43 years I've been a professional sports journalist. And the bulk of that time, I've been allowed to give my opinion as a commentator or as a columnist. And that has allowed me to write about everything. So it depends on the season. You know, like right now, I love the NBA playoffs going on. In the fall, I love the fact that you got college football and the NFL. And I love the sort of baseball. So it's across the board.
You mentioned being a Jackie Robinson of sports columnists. I was going to mention this later on, but you've been awarded by the National Association of Black Journalists as being the longest running black sports columnist in the nation ever.
In the history of major newspapers, yeah. And that was, 30 consecutive, 33 straight years. And the way that newspapers are constructed now, and the way they're dying, right, and shrinking staffs, I doubt very seriously anybody's ever going to break that record. And essentially, so people can understand this, when you're a sports columnist, that means you're allowed to give your opinion. Right. And so I was only the third black sports writer ever allowed to give his opinion for a major metropolitan newspaper when I worked for the San Francisco Examiner. That was back in 1983. And prior to that, you had a guy named Tom Greer, Philadelphia Daily News, 1978. He lasted for about 6 or 7 months as a general sports columnist. Then the second one was Ralph Wiley. I'm not sure if you heard of Ralph or not, but the late Ralph Wiley.
I'm older than you. I'm older than you, bro. I've heard him all.
Yeah, right. And Ralph worked at the Oakland Tribune for about a couple of years before he left for Sports Illustrated. But when I became the sports columnist, or at least one of them at the San Francisco Examiner in 83, I lasted from that point all the way through the time I left the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in 2009. So it's going to be a long-standing record.
Terence, tell folks, I may know, but tell folks the difference. You are a journalist, a writer, a reporter, yes, broadcast and print, but a columnist is a little different, is it not?
Well, it's a lot different. I mean, you have beat writers, and beat writers are people who are assigned to a specific team. Right. You might have a lot of people who might be, say, an NFL beat writer. And by the way, to continue this theme about Jackie Robinson, at the San Francisco Examiner, when I went there in 1980, I was assigned to the Oakland Raiders, and I was the first black person ever to cover a National Football League team on a regular basis for a major metropolitan newspaper. And again, that's when you're assigned to a specific beat. Some people are assigned to a specific sport to write general things about them, about it. Like say, maybe the NBA or college football, what have you. But when you're a columnist, you're allowed to give your opinion about whatever. And this is very important. One of the reasons that we've had very few black sports columnists through the years, and I was only the third one, you can see the racism that's involved in the media because they didn't want us, black people, giving our opinion. Okay. We were allowed to play sports. Some of us, very few, and that's another thing, misconception. There are not that many black sports writers, contrary to popular belief. Very few of us were even allowed to write about sports, and very, very, very few have been allowed through the years to give their opinion about sports. And I know a lot of people out there saying, "Oh, what about this guy? What about that guy?" But if you look at the ESPNs of the world, I would say probably about 90% of the so-called commentators, when it comes to sports on national television or what have you, are former athletes or former coaches. When it comes to black folks, when it comes to white folks, it's different. You can be a good journalist per se, and be a white person and be hired all day long to write about sports or give your opinion about sports. But there are very few black people who weren't professional athletes or what have you, a professional coach who has been allowed to give their opinion or write about their opinion.
Terence, on that note, in 1972, after graduating from the University of Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, my first job was covering Don Shula at the Miami Dolphins.
Oh, wow.
I asked him a journalism question. He looked at me and said, "Who the hell are you?" And he got me out of there. It wasn't a rah-rah, hey, coach kind of question. He didn't like it. I never covered the Dolphins again because I was the only black guy in the room. How did you get there? What distinguished you in your career to get to that status, that pioneering status? I know it wasn't easy, bro. I've been here. I've been in the field too.
Well, and part of it is the family that I came from. And I came from a family of Jackie Robinsons. My dad, for instance, my dad started out as a janitor at AT&T in South Bend back in the early 50s, and he ended up being the first black supervisor for AT&T in the history of the Midwest, one of only two ever, one of the first two black supervisors in the history of AT&T. He and his best friend helped integrate the golf courses in South Bend, Indiana, back in the late 1950s. And then even going further back than that, my dad was a paratrooper in the Army, Korean War, and he was like one of the few black paratroopers back then during that time period. My mom in South Bend, there was a place called Associates of Savings and Loans Company. She was like the first black person ever to work for that. My brother Daryl was the first black baseball player in the history of the University of Wisconsin. So this goes on and on and on. So then they get to me. I was the first. I went to school at Miami of Ohio, Miami University, which is the oldest college west of the Alleghenies. It has the oldest college newspaper ever in the United States. I was the first black writer in the history of that paper, first black editor in the history of the Miami student newspaper. Went to the Cincinnati Enquirer as an intern. I was the first black intern they ever had. Paper been around since 1840. I was the first black sports writer the Cincinnati Enquirer ever had. Only the second black writer, period. Then I went to the San Francisco Examiner, became the first black sports writer in the history of San Francisco Examiner. Damn. So it was one of those type of things where, from being a spiritual person, I always believe everything is meant to be. And if you believe in God and if you understand the concepts of how spirituality works, one of my favorite scriptures is Romans 8:28. All things work together for good for those who love God and called according to his purpose. Then you know that you're meant to be in certain situations. So I was just meant to be that guy when it comes to a black person in journalism.
But Terence, you had to rise to those occasions. They didn't give it to you. Was it timing or talent or both?
Yeah, and that's a good question. And I'll add something else to that.